The recent Channel 4 documentary on the Lucy Letby case featured contributions from the Daily Mail journalist Liz Hull, also known for her podcast series on the trial, which she doesn't like to talk about. In this video, we're going to look at the contribution of Liz Hull to that documentary and analyse the legitimacy or otherwise of comments that she made. The first thing that Liz Hull said is the following. At the beginning, we didn't know that much about her, meaning Lucy, but we knew she was this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pretty nurse that was the face of the hospital's fundraising campaign. There was nothing unusual about her. She was kind of this typical girl next door, I suppose. Now, what Liz Hull fails to mention here is that that is still what we know about Lucy Letby today. There has been no dirt dug up on Lucy Letby whatsoever, other than these allegations that I obviously believe to be false that have been levelled at her. She still is exactly the way that she's described there. There is nothing unusual about her. She is a typical girl next door. Even the police acknowledged this at the time of her arrest and at the time of her conviction. So then Liz Hull says the following. Dr. Dewi Evans was the lead prosecution expert. It was his job to explain to the jury how these babies came to be murdered by Lucy Letby. So her early comments are just simply repeating rather banal statements statements made by the prosecution and also just general statements. But there's a theme that runs through all of her contributions to this documentary, and that is she talks about all the time the court, 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 the court. That's all she talks about, as you will see. That'll be a pattern. In fact, you'll get sick of hearing about that by the time this is over. So the next thing Liz Hull says is, in the end, the jury decided that Lucy Letby was guilty. But I think all of us that were sat there in that courtroom... Hold on a second, Liz. I didn't realise you were in court. I've never heard you bring that up before. You really should mention that more often. Understood why they'd come to that decision. It was multiple strands of evidence. The medical evidence was obviously important, but there were lots of different pieces of the jigsaw that came together. So I will respond to this rather banal statement. The first thing is that she's drawing immediately on this kind of elitist argument that we weren't in court, so that we're not entitled to an opinion. This is something that Dr. Evans has used previously as well. But Liz Hull is saying, I was in court, in case I haven't mentioned that previously, and only the people in court can possibly have an opinion on this. So essentially a very elitist argument, but then also it's worth noting that would mean no one is allowed an opinion on any court case at any time, anywhere in England, or Britain indeed, or in fact anywhere in the world pretty much, unless they're working on it, or they are the defendant, because as possibly some families might attend every day. Who attends every day of a court case that lasts 10 months unless they're being paid to do it? Who has the time to do that? It's basically the people that are working on it, Lucy and Lucy's parents. I don't think even the parents of the infants attended the whole court case as far as I'm aware. Basically no one does, because it's completely impractical. You can't just take 10 months out of your life to attend every day of a court case. It's completely ridiculous. And then another thing I'd like to point out is, does she complain about the people who didn't attend the court case, who think that Lucy Letby is guilty and listen to her crappy podcast? I would suggest that she doesn't complain about those people. She only complains about the people who disagree with her. In terms of this comment about a jigsaw, that's actually a very accurate statement, because what happens with a jigsaw is you start off with a picture and then you cut the pieces out to form the jigsaw. So that's an entirely accurate description, inadvertently, that Liz Hull has made of this court case. The next thing I want to look at is this different strands statement that she makes. So she says it's multiple strands of evidence that came together. So this is a kind of there is no smoke without fire theory. This is very deliberately used by the prosecution. So I think they use this in two ways. The first way is that they drew the court case out for as long as possible, indeed the ridiculous length of 10 months, to make it seem that, as I say, there is no smoke without fire. Look at all these allegations we've got. There must be something. In addition, if these were tried as standalone cases, well, I don't think they would have gone to court. Never mind when anything happened. But if you just simply took Child K as an example and said, oh, look, a tube might have come out at some point. We didn't even properly establish that. Lucy Letby might have been around, but we didn't properly establish that. And I think maybe I possibly saw something, although another account says something completely different, and then the baby recovered and died 3 days later in a different hospital, you'd be laughed out of court, and obviously rightly so. Some of the other cases are equally bad. Child C is a very obvious bowel obstruction. Child D, there was appalling care in that case. Same with child A. I could go on. Some of these infants are very vulnerable. Some of these infants are very unwell. As standalone cases, they wouldn't be in the court case. So this idea of bringing together all the different strands was used by the prosecution, as well as being used here as an argument by Liz Hull. So the question would be, at this point, is Liz Hull thick or is Liz Hull biased? So we will address that as the video continues, but this argument about there were a lot of different strands, so therefore people in court can't have an opinion because they haven't seen all of the 1 million arguments that were brought forward, is absolute nonsense. The reason that it's nonsense, and barristers have actually said this, I've forgotten the name of one of them who appeared on BBC File on 4 and pointed out, well, 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 is still equal 0. It doesn't matter how many zeros you have. If you have a million pieces of crap evidence, if you start off with one piece of crap evidence, we can all agree it's a piece of crap evidence. If you have 2 pieces of crap evidence, we can all agree that's 2 pieces of crap evidence. If you have a million pieces of crap evidence, the first piece of crap evidence hasn't suddenly gained value because you've got a million of them. So to express this mathematically, 0 to the power of 1 million is still 0. And indeed, 0 to the power of 1 billion is still 0. And 0 to the power of 1 trillion is still 0. What matters in this court case, and indeed in any court case, is the strength of the evidence. It doesn't matter if there's a lot of different... I just saw all these different strands that came together and then it convinced me that she was guilty. But when you actually look at all the strands, they're all total rubbish. That means that it's rubbish. It doesn't make your decision legitimate. It doesn't make the court case stronger because there's a lot of rubbish. It's still just rubbish. So the next thing she says is one of the most incriminating pieces of evidence was the green post-it note on which she'd written, "I am evil, I did this, and I killed them on purpose." I think the police couldn't quite believe it that they found something so significant when they raided her house. Now, I'm going to bring up some points against this. I want to mention firstly that we don't know when this was recorded. So, for example, the last point, she didn't actually know about that time, so I'll say that in her defence. However, Liz Hull is firstly ignoring all of the other comments on the note, so this is well established. I've listed some of them here. Not good enough, there are no words, I can't breathe, I can't focus, kill myself right now, overwhelming fear, no hope, I'll never have children, I haven't done anything wrong, never have children or marry, never know what it's like to have a family, slander, discrimination, victimisation, all getting too much, taking over my life, everything, hate myself so much, despair, panic, fear, lost, I feel very alone and scared. What does the future hold? How can I get through it? I don't deserve to live. I don't deserve mum and dad. They are better off without me. So any kind of reasonable, rational person would conclude that this is a person in a state of deep trauma who's very scared about the circumstances that she finds herself in, and that is commenting here about the slander, discrimination and victimisation, as she puts it, that she has experienced at the hands of the hospital and then at the hands of the police. So I've already begun going through the timeline of that, and I will conclude that timeline shortly, but I mean, this is well documented, it's in the Thirlwell documents, it's not contentious or controversial in any way, in fact it's absolutely proven by those documents. So Liz Hull has firstly ignored that completely and done literally what the police has done. The difference is the police were stupid at the time, but Liz Hull's had a lot of time to reflect on how stupid the police are, and she's completely endorsing what the police did. The next thing she's ignored is the fact that this explanation that I have on the screen now, all of these things that were written in this letter, that was given in court. So I think I'm right in saying Liz was in court. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but if she was in court, then she would have heard all this being discussed in court. It just had absolutely no impact on her whatsoever. The next thing that she's ignored is the fact that Lucy explained this explicitly during her police interviews. I've actually been over some of that already, and I'll be going over the remainder of the police interviews that we have available in the weeks and months to come. Of course, I would go over all of the police interviews, but in this country, the police don't think they have to be transparent in any way. They think they can release an incredibly small amount of the overall interview, and that's somehow satisfactory, and that they don't have to be publicly accountable. The next thing is that she ignored all of the other notes, particularly the blue post-it note, which features this expression that I've mentioned several times previously, that there is obviously no evidence against her, that Lucy has written herself. The next thing is that Liz has ignored all of the revelations related to Catherine de Beger. So we know that Lucy's written these notes, particularly the green note, on the advice of counsellors. That's been established. That's not debatable in any way. In addition to that, Catherine de Beger appeared at the Thirlwell inquiry and spoke very fondly of Lucy. Since this section with Liz Hall was likely recorded, there's also been this recent expert opinion that's come up from Professor Gisli Gudjonsson, who has explained that the notes are unreliable evidence. It shouldn't really need an expert, frankly, because literally no one with any sense thinks the confession note is significant. Even Professor David Wilson, who is chronically biased and his commentary on this case has been largely asinine, even he doesn't think the confession note has any significance. So why Liz is still saying it has significant, you would need to ask her, but essentially it's a ridiculous, absurd argument at this point. So next, Liz says, the police uncovered 250 handover notes, most of which were in a bag under her bed. Those notes are supposed to go in the confidential waste bin. They aren't ever supposed to go home with staff. The prosecution said this was evidence that Lucy Letby was keeping trophies of her crimes. Now, the handover sheets are the bane of my existence, truly, and if I have to explain them ever again, there's a possibility that I'll end my life. But I am going to go over the handover notes again, seeing as she has mentioned them, but I'm going to do it as briefly as possible, because I've probably dealt with them, I don't know, must be 50 times by now. But firstly, Liz has ignored the fact this is completely unrelated to the indictment. So this has nothing to do with the indictment whatsoever. It's nothing to do with the crimes. Essentially, it's completely irrelevant. Secondly, she's ignored the fact that the prosecution themselves made it crystal clear in court that Lucy treasured one specific note, and this also was completely unrelated to the indictment because it was 5 years. It dated back from 5 years before any of the cases that were remotely related to the indictment. Thirdly, Liz has ignored the fact that the majority of handover sheets are unrelated to the case. And then, of course, she's ignored the fact that many sheets were found in a bin bag in Lucy Letby's garage, ready to be thrown away, as were those under her bed. Contrary to the way that Liz Hall presents it here, it's not like she was storing or keeping those notes in any kind of significant way as trophies. They were stuffed in a Morrison's carrier bag, and she obviously just hadn't thrown them away because they were semi-confidential. And I've discussed not only the fact that other nurses, many nurses have mentioned in the comments section, many nurses have mentioned on social media, many nurses have gone on record to say taking handover sheets inadvertently is not uncommon. In fact, pretty much every nurse that has ever worked in a hospital will have done this, just as I explained myself. I have taken, when I had a job in which there were some confidential documents, I sometimes took them home in my pocket. It's so easily done. We used to have a shift sheet of cases and you'd put them in your inside suit pocket and then you'd go home at the end of the day and it'd be there. The difference is that I didn't make a massive fuss out of it. I just threw them away because it was going into a confidential waste. It was going into a waste chute in my house, flat where I lived at the time. Who the hell is going to go through a communal waste chute to try and find something that's not even of any use to them anyway? The problem for Lucy was she couldn't do that. She lived in a house, so clearly she'd bundled these things together in a bin bag, but she couldn't chuck them in the bin. She thought, well, that would be controversial. She couldn't shred them because there were too many. It's bloody obvious what happened here. If I have to explain this ever again. So, but I mean, regardless of this, regardless of that explanation, which is blindingly obvious, it's extremely weak evidence for a murder trial, i.e. it has no evidential value whatsoever. That would apply if she'd only taken home sheets that relate to the indictment. But as the vast majority of sheets are nothing to do with the indictment, that just makes it absolutely farcical that people continue to raise this as if it has any relevance whatsoever. So I don't expect to hear anyone in the comments section raise this ever again. The next thing Liz Hall said is they discovered that she'd done hundreds and hundreds of Facebook searches, often for the parents of the babies that she murdered and harmed. Some of the searches took place at very odd times, late on Christmas Day. So why is that relevant, Liz? Why is it relevant they were done on Christmas Day? What the hell does that have to do with anything? Nothing. This was just another nonsense argument that if you had any intelligence whatsoever or any intention of being objective, you would recognise that this was just a nonsense argument that was put in court by the prosecution. However, leaving that aside, Liz has ignored the fact that this is unrelated to the indictment. Again, this is nothing to do with the allegations that were made in court. It's completely unrelated. She's ignored the fact that many nurses do Facebook searches. Essentially, this is nothing out of the ordinary for people all over the country. I personally don't use Facebook. I have got a Facebook account. I had to have one for work reasons, but I don't use it because I don't really care about Facebook. But, it can be a useful platform, and some people enjoy it a lot. And, there's certainly some groups to do with the Lucy Letby case on Facebook that are valid and relevant. But I can say I definitely would not go through Facebook searching for people that I know or that I've vaguely known and stuff like that. But we can hardly consider this to be an unusual activity. It's something that people do all the time. So I don't think that we can or should be too hard on Lucy for that. Again, the biggest thing though is that she made 31 Facebook searches relate to the case compared to 2,287 that were unrelated. I mean, it's an extraordinary gulf between the two. You'd expect them to be at least somewhere closer than that, like 31 versus 2,287. So it's 99% nothing to do with the case. So just purely this alone shows a complete lack of objectivity. If you're citing this as being significant, 31 compared to 2,287. Let's bear in mind, even if the percentages were different, it still has absolutely no evidential value, but clearly this is just nothing to do with the case. And the idea that people will cite this and say, oh, Facebook searches, embarrassing. Especially for a journalist, embarrassing. So next thing Liz Hull said is, so after a trial lasting for over 10 months and more than 110 hours of painstaking deliberation, she made some comment. I think this is probably transcribed slightly incorrectly, but she made some comment about the jury and looking at the sum total of the evidence. And she says, you can't take one piece of evidence and say that proves she's innocent or guilty. So this is just essentially repeating the redundant strands argument that she made earlier. So I've already dealt with that. So I'll just briefly mention that no one is saying you can take one piece of evidence and say that proves she's innocent or guilty, Liz. That's a straw man argument or a straw woman argument, you might say. No one is saying that. So I don't know why you're saying that as if it has some relevance. It doesn't have any relevance at all. So at this point, I've bundled together the comments that she made about Child O, which didn't follow entirely chronologically in the documentary. So here she's saying, today in this episode we're focusing on the 15th baby. This is just her presenting a podcast. So the prosecution say Lucy Letby murdered during her first shift back at work after a holiday to Ibiza at the end of June 2016. So you notice that that's her introduction to the episode. So immediately her introduction to the episode focuses on what the prosecution say, which is pretty much what every episode does, as we will find out as we continue to look at Liz's work in the weeks and months to come. Baby O was a baby that was one of 3 identical triplets, and when Lucy Letby came onto shift there were no concerns about Baby O's health, but a few hours later he collapsed and started to deteriorate. He then collapsed a second time and then passed away. The doctors could find no medical explanation for this other than Lucy Letby was around at the time of his collapse. That's not a medical explanation, Liz, just to let you know. Lucy Letby being around at the time of his collapse is not a medical explanation. Initially, I thought, well, maybe there's something in this. This is Liz commenting about recent revelations regarding Child O. So I went away, spent a few days going back over my trial notes. Were you in court, Liz? I didn't realise you were in court. You really should bring that up more often. For example, the case of Baby O. At the first press conference, they accused a doctor of inserting a needle and causing the liver injury that killed Baby O. At the second press conference, the expert panel appeared to contradict this version of events. This time, a botched delivery was responsible for the liver injury. There was no mention of a botched delivery at the trial. The delivery went well. The issue of whether Baby O had been injured by a needle was discussed at length before the jury. The pathology that's being questioned was definitive. There was an attempt to try and save this baby's life. Experts in court supported the view that that was deemed appropriate. So I'm going to go over all of these comments rather than addressing them as we went through them. I just wanted to read everything that she said about Child O. So I'm going to go over everything that she said and discuss whether or not it has legitimacy and whether or not she's presented it fairly. Now, before we go any further, I just want to say that I don't think Liz has made any effort to understand the case. All she has tried to do is understand the prosecution case, and then she just repeats that ad nauseum. But on the screen now we have the panel opinion for child O. So the first thing to note is that Liz completely failed to mention the subcapsular hematoma. So if we scroll down here, you can see baby 15 collapsed because the subcapsular hematoma ruptured, causing acute major hemorrhage into the peritoneal cavity, sufficient to cause a near halving of the hemoglobin level. Somehow, Liz failed to mention the subcapsular hematoma during her insightful comments. The second thing to mention is that this infant has already had a pathology report from people who actually examined the infant, unlike Dr. Evans, for example. So the comments that Dr. Evans made and the so-called diagnosis that Dr. Evans put into this court case, that was not evident to the pathologist that examined the infant. So when you look at this infant as a whole, the way that she's described it is quite farcical. This is a very detailed clinical picture of exactly what occurred with this infant that is authored by absolute experts, and this is only a précis synopsis of their full report that will be extremely detailed, having looked at tens of thousands of documents and put an enormous amount of time and effort into it. So for Liz Hull to sit there and say, oh, I think their opinion is wrong, and according to my case notes, this has already been discussed, it's pretty farcical and just shows the extent to which she leans on the prosecution case and the court case. Indeed, as I say, she's made no effort to understand this case in its totality or holistically. She just simply repeats the prosecution case over and over again and says, I was in court, I was in court, I was in court. That's all she's capable of doing. So with regard to the needle aspiration issue, somehow Liz fails to mention that we know this happened because there's a document that indicates that it happened. There's in the Thirlwell inquiry. She claims that the issue of whether child O had been injured by a needle was discussed before the jury, but there's an obvious vested interest in this, in that the person who conducted this procedure was giving evidence in court. The person that botched what is a routine procedure said, well, I didn't. So that's what she cites as evidence that this didn't occur. And it's this thing that Liz has all the time. Well, there was no mention of a botched delivery at the trial, the jury, the court. That's all she ever goes on about. The next thing is that when you look at the panel's opinion, you're looking at a very nuanced clinical opinion that is based on all these things coming together collectively. I've discussed this in previous videos. It's not just simply a case. And Liz just seems to be unable to understand this, or maybe unwilling. You'd have to ask her which one it is. But it's not just simply a case of this caused this and that's it. That's just not the way these things work. That's not the way human biology works or medicine works. But in these very complex cases of infants that are collapsing and dying on a neonatal unit, they have very complex anatomy, and there's a complex clinical picture involved, and it does take experts to piece together through the case notes in order to understand what's happened. Now, as we saw from the performance of Dr. Evans in this documentary that I've discussed previously, he's nowhere near up to the standard required to do that, and that's why he said so many ridiculous, stupid things, and that's why he now looks like a complete idiot. Now, bear in mind that Liz is just backing up his opinion, really, and with no basis. So, for example, in the case of Child O, and this is something that she doesn't discuss, Dr. Evans just invented some incident that the pathologist never mentioned at all. The pathology, when they examine the infant, they never said that it looks like someone's thrust a tool down the throat of this infant repeatedly. That's just something Dr. Evans made up out of nothing. There's never been backed up by anything or anyone. Now, I don't see Liz talking about that quite so much. She then claims that the pathology that's being questioned was definitive. It's not definitive because we've heard from 3 pathologists, and only the one that appeared in court, who was very much prompted by Dr. Evans, was of this opinion. So it's actually a minority of pathologists that make this assertion, and in fact it's only one, Margarides, who was prompted by Dr. Evans and is indeed a minority of one that believes this, or that has asserted this. Then Liz says there was an attempt to try and save this baby's life. No one contests this, Liz. This is completely irrelevant. No one contests that they attempted to try to save the baby's life on the unit. That's utterly meaningless, in fact. And then she goes on to say, experts in court supported the view that was deemed appropriate. Like, what does that even mean, Liz? You mean the experts in court deemed that it was appropriate to try to save the baby's life? Like, what are you even talking about? So again, with Liz, you can see she has an extremely poor grasp of these issues, which, given that she's invested a lot of her professional life in this, is very curious. It would really be up to her to answer whether she just can't understand it or whether she's chronically biased. We'll continue to examine that and assess that as this video continues. So the next thing that Liz Hull said was, Lucy Letby wasn't the designated nurse for baby C, but she was on duty, and in fact she was around a lot of the time when he was sadly passing away. Prosecution alleged that she injected air into his tummy via his feeding tube, and this caused his tummy to inflate like a balloon and his diaphragm to splint, which eventually caused him to suffocate. So let's go through these statements one by one. Lucy Letby wasn't the designated nurse for baby C, but she was in duty, and in fact she was around a lot of the time when he was sadly passing away. So Liz was going to completely ignore the shifting of the days that occurred in court. She couldn't eventually because someone put a question to her about it and then she had to say something. The second thing is she's completely ignoring the clinical picture of this infant. So we'll just briefly go over the clinical picture of child C. So child C is quite frankly a very obvious bowel obstruction. I think even I can understand that just by looking at the clinical picture and doing a little bit of research. It's not even that it's difficult to understand. He's just showing very explicit symptoms of a bowel obstruction. And that's why so many experts have cited the fact that this infant died due to a bowel obstruction. So obviously this is a vulnerable infant to begin with gestational age of 30 weeks, just born at just 800 grams. We see all these things being cited like reversed and diastolic blood flow, high risk of intrauterine demise. This is acknowledged by Dr. Evans. It's not like Dr. Evans didn't say this. Dr. Evans wrote in his report that this infant was at high risk of collapse and death. This is known to be the case. This infant shouldn't even have been on this unit in the first place, as is stated in this report. Problems with blood, problems with being cold on admission, problem with respiratory distress syndrome, and then multiple clinical signs of intermittent bowel obstruction, no bowel opening from birth, dark bilious aspirates, bilious vomit, intermittent stomach and small bowel distension, recurrent crying, no bowel movements, dark bile aspirates and vomiting. There should have been, urgent surgical intervention in this case, and they just completely failed. And I'm not going to go through it over the whole thing. I'll just go to the panel opinion. Child C did not respond adequately to prolonged resuscitation because of inadequate resuscitation for 20 minutes following an acute episode of apnea, recovering respiratory distress syndrome and severe growth restriction with myocardial ischemia would have added further to the likelihood of a poor response to resuscitation. The apneic attack was likely precipitated by severe pain due to a further episode of acute small bowel obstruction. Go over to the other page. In a second I'll get there. Precipitate by feeding. The suggestion that the multiple signs of intestinal obstruction could be caused by injection of air through the nasogastric tube is untenable. Obviously it's untenable. It's utterly ridiculous, frankly. So in conclusion, child C died because of a decision to discontinue respiratory support and resuscitative effort in the face of a poor response following inadequate resuscitation for at least 20 minutes after an acute episode of apnea. Now let's just reflect on this for a second. Firstly, that is an enormous medical blunder by any reasonable standard. Another thing to reflect on is that Dr. Evans has said these infants didn't require any oxygen, these infants didn't require respiratory support. Whereas when you get an actual expert looking at this case, the expert says this infant died because of a failure to give respiratory support. Dr. Evans says the infant was fine, and as evidence of that, I cite the fact that it didn't require infants' respiratory support, whereas someone who actually knows what they're talking about says actually the fact they failed to continue respiratory support led to the death of this infant. Pretty big difference, I'm sure you'll agree. Then the second thing they just simply say is the clear prior signs of intermittent bowel obstruction that warranted urgent surgical opinion and investigation had gone unrecognised. Again, this is an enormous blunder, because for anyone experienced in neonatology and in these infants, The signs were very clear. They had classic signs of bowel obstruction. It's not even difficult. It shouldn't even need a doctor like the nurses, to be honest. Maybe, I don't know how much Lucy should have known. Maybe even Lucy should have recognised this. I don't know. It's not for me to say, but I know when I've spoken to an experienced neonatal nurse. I mean, I'm sure Michelle would have noticed, and I'm sure Michelle would be saying it looks like a bowel obstruction. I mean, I can't remember if I spoke with Michelle about this case or not, but if I haven't, then I'll have to ask her about it. But it's very clear that there was a bowel obstruction, and when I've spoken to experienced neonatal nurses, they have said, it's got all the classic signs, and it's not difficult to confirm that. Anyone can just Google it. You really don't need to have any neonatal experience to see that there were almighty blunders in this case with a very unwell infant that would have been vulnerable, under threat of collapse, under threat of potential death anyway. They made some almighty mistakes in this case, and what Dr. Evans has said in relation to this case is a joke. It is frankly an utter joke, and I can't imagine any neonatologist in the world, if you found a single other neonatologist, you asked every single neonatologist in the world, so there's over 200 countries, I estimate there's 500 in this country, there's probably less than 500 on average over the countries as a whole, so if we averaged it down to 250 and say there's 200 countries, not entirely accurate, but that would mean there'll be approximately 5,000 neonatologists in the world. I'm sure there's more than 5,000, but let's say for the sake of argument, there are 5,000. If you asked all of those 5,000 neonatologists, do you think this infant died due to an injection of air into the stomach? And do you think this infant was okay at the time of the infant's death? And do you think this infant was requiring no respiratory support? I would be surprised if out of those 5,000 there was even one that supported Dr. Evans. And yet Liz Hull is still sitting there going, oh, well, I think this is all perfectly fine. I just want to mention as well that when I interviewed Professor Colin Morley in this video that you can see on the screen now, he cited a very obvious bowel obstruction in the case of child C. So another asinine argument made here by Liz is that Lucy Letby wasn't the designated nurse for child C, but she was on duty, and in fact she was around a lot of the time when he was sadly passing away. Yeah, she's a nurse, Liz. This is why shifting the days is so important, because the shift chart argument runs through the whole trial. So whenever there's no evidence for something, which is a lot of the time, they just say, oh, but Lucy Letby was the only person on duty. So that's why it's absolutely critical to the entire court case, and why it does matter that they shifted the days in this particular case. So then we had Philip Hammond with regard to this saying, it wasn't until Evans was on the witness stand, despite it not appearing in any of his reports, he suddenly said, I think the baby could also have had air injected into a vein. Mark McDonald says he just made it up as he went along. The case in point, in fact, the greatest example of the case in point is baby C. So here, Liz says, I just don't think it is important. So Liz, who previously always says, oh, what about the court, the jury, the regulations, the barristers, the judge, all she ever goes on about over and over again, the court. Now, she just suddenly says, oh, well, I just don't think it's important. I don't think it's important if the lead prosecution witness just suddenly changes tack completely in the middle of a court case. That just doesn't matter at all, as far as I'm concerned. I've decided that that's not important. As an example, there are the Criminal Procedure Rules 2020, which provide extensive guidelines for what expert witnesses are supposed to do and not supposed to do. Usually this is the kind of thing that Liz is interested in, but here she's just decided that it's not important. Then she goes on to say, the jury were reminded by the lead prosecutor in his closing speech that Lucy Letby wasn't on duty on June the 12th. That's not relevant. It's not relevant. What is relevant is that they've changed the incidents at the last minute because Lucy Letby is not on duty. That's what's relevant. Not that the jury were told by the prosecutor that Lucy Letby wasn't on duty on the 12th. That's irrelevant because they've now shifted that out of the court case. She also says Dr. Evans was supported in court by at least 7 medical experts. Not at least. It's not at least. It is 7. And as we've discussed on many previous occasions, they offered very minimal support to Dr. Evans. However, in this instance, it's completely irrelevant because Dr. Evans and Dr. Evans alone made this decision to shift the incident at the 11th hour. And then she goes on to make this comment, but actually there's only one prosecution expert giving media interviews, isn't there? I'm sure the others have seen the way that Dr. Evans has been treated online and the way his opinions have been ridiculed, and have looked at that and thought, I don't want to speak publicly for that reason. Now, I would just brush over this quickly, but I've recently encountered something that deals with the abuse, the so-called abuse that Dr. Evans has encountered. It's not quite big enough for a standalone video, but I would like to look at it here just so that we can see what kind of abuse Dr. Evans has encountered. So I only found this the other day. It's Dr. Evans appearing on the Today programme on Monday the 8th of July last year. And the sole subject of this interview was indeed the supposed abuse that Dr. Evans has been receiving. So let's look at what was said in this Today programme. It's just a segment that lasts for 5 minutes. I've got a transcript here. So the interviewer says, one aspect of the Lucy Letby case that you may not be aware of is the opprobrium, abuse and worse delivered to those whose evidence helped to convict her. So all opprobrium means is strong criticism. Opprobrium is not abuse. Strong criticism, when warranted and where merited, is not a problem. I don't know what worse than abuse would be. That would mean physical violence. There's clearly no evidence of physical violence, so it's already sensationalist to say that Dr. Evans has suffered worse than abuse, because that would have to be physical assaults. We know for a fact that hasn't happened. So anyway, here he goes. One of those is Dr. Dewi Evans. So it's pretty much entirely focused on Dr. Evans. He's not just one of the people who's received opprobrium. He's pretty much the only one. I suppose Bohin to a certain extent, but most of the opprobrium, quite rightly, has been directed at Dr. Evans because he's responsible for 95% of the prosecution case, conservatively. So anyway, the interviewer welcomes Dr. Evans to the programme. Good morning. Interviewer, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Could you tell us, this is classic, immediately, just classic. Could you tell us at what point your involvement in the case started causing you problems on social media and elsewhere? So what does he say immediately? But remember what I said previously, he hasn't got any social media accounts. I'm not convinced he's had any abuse on social media at all. Well, I pay very little attention to social media. So that's it. So immediately, you might as well just say, thank you for joining us, Dr. Evans. You can leave now. But just go on for another few minutes. But I received an email from a journalist source on the 27th of June, so recently, saying that several people had complained about me to the GMC, the General Medical Council. So that's not abuse. That's just people reporting to the General Medical Council because of your behaviour and your conduct, which is entirely warranted. This was clearly an awful shock. Well, not really, because you're never going to work as a doctor again. You haven't worked as a doctor for the last 20 years. You've even said you retired as being a witness. So, and you're not even registered. Are you even registered with the General Medical Council? Who cares? What difference does it make to your life, apart from the fact that you've got an enormous ego? This was clearly an awful shock, but not particularly surprising in one way, because back in the day when those of us were giving evidence in cases of child abuse, now I'm going to bring up. Now Dr. Evans is going to bring up something that has no relevance to this whatsoever. It was not uncommon for the suspects, the abusers, to intimidate the doctors by complaining about them to the GMC. So that isn't what has occurred in these circumstances. This is not what has occurred at all. These two things cannot be compared in any way. What has occurred is that qualified doctors have complained to the GMC because of your behaviour, because of your conduct, and because of what you've done in this court case. That is not abuse. That is in no way similar to suspects of child abuse trying to intimidate doctors as you described here. It's not similar in the slightest, let alone can it be directly compared. So then he goes, that happened quite a lot in the 1980s and 1990s, but for it to occur now is rather surprising. Then the interviewer says, the essential point is that there are lots of people online and in the real world who do not accept that Lucy Letby has been found guilty and who don't really want to come to terms with the fact that in a court of law someone has been found guilty of killing babies. So another crass, banal point here from the Today programme interview. I wouldn't expect anything else. It's not the fact that we can't come to terms with it. Like, no one objects, okay, this is killing babies, but I've not seen anyone object to the conviction of Wayne Couzens for killing Sarah Everard, because they found her body on his land and he was caught on camera speaking to her and he pleaded guilty. It's not that people can't come to terms with things, it's that the evidence doesn't support Lucy Letby being guilty. And obviously, as you should know, as a journalist who's fronting the Radio 4 Today programme, you should know that courts get things wrong all the time. So it's not some act of temerity or audacity to question what the court has done. It is indeed the act of a responsible citizen. So Dr. Evans then says, that's right. It's such a shocking thing to come to terms with. One of the ways people deal with shocking news is to go into denial and shoot the messenger. That's what's happened in this case, I'm afraid. So again, he just makes these ridiculous assertions, but I'm not going to dwell on this too much. We could spend 20 minutes analysing this. It's very difficult for people to accept that these murders and injuries were not caused by some stereotypical monster, but by a young white English nurse from a respectable background. How on earth can you stomach that? One way of dealing with it, of course, is to deny that it happened at all. What's your assessment of how her background, her appearance, her name and her disposition affected how some people interpret a guilt? Can I just point out at this point, we're supposed to be talking about how Dr. Evans has been abused. But let's continue. Her crime was, in effect, hiding in plain sight. She could not have caused these deaths except for the fact that she was working as a nurse in a neonatal unit. To get away with it for so long, apart from the incompetence of the general managers who refused to listen to the concerns of the doctors, she had to fit in. If there had been it's just classic again. If there had been peculiarities in her behaviour, if she had fallen out with colleagues, if she'd been absent frequently or had problems with drugs, alcohol or other issues, she would have been spotted as someone unsuitable for neonatal work. But because she appeared superficially to be perfectly normal, and that's essential for anyone committing crimes while hiding in plain sight, she was able to continue. So a new area of expertise here for Dr. Evans now is criminology as well. So basically what Lucy has done, unlike other criminals and unlike everything we know about criminology and what we know about serial killers and murderers, is that instead of displaying aberrant behaviour because she's a serial killer, she's managed to suppress all of that and decide not to do drugs, for example. Whereas other serial killers who've done drugs have just decided, they haven't been able to make the decision not to do that, so they've stuck out and they've had all these criminogenic factors which have pointed to the fact that they are consistent with being a serial killer, whereas, of course, Lucy Letby is not consistent with being a serial killer because Dr. Evans is talking complete shit, as usual. So then he goes on to say, the same was true of Harold Shipman and, of course, Jimmy Savile, who was able to mix with royalty and everyone else and still get away with it. It's crucial for people like that to appear, as it were, normal. So I don't think Jimmy Savile was considered normal. I mean, pretty much everyone had... There was an enormous amount of people that had heard rumours and suspicions of him. So, I mean, that's a really bad comparison. And Harold Shipman obviously was a GP who had enormous opportunity to commit crimes. And, of course, one of the reasons he was caught was because he was altering the wills of patients that had died. So, I mean, two incredibly bad comparisons with Lucy Letby there. Then the interviewer says, it's worth saying, Dr. Evans, that many paediatricians of your generation have been traduced, publicly and often privately, because of their roles in cases such as this. Just for the benefit of our listeners and mindful that it's breakfast time, could you give us a sense of some of the abuse and threats you've received? Yeah, let's get back on topic. That's a good idea. You mentioned a letter to the GMC, but how else have members of the Lucy Letby's Innocent Brigade expressed their displeasure? Dr. Evans says, well, as I say, I avoid social media and therefore avoid all the hysterics and emotive language that people use. So again, he hasn't actually encountered any abuse at all. But going back to previous cases, I was involved in one dreadful abuse case in Swansea, so I'm now going to talk about something completely different. I've been asked to give even one example of when I've been abused. I can't do that, so now I'll just change the subject to something that happened in Swansea, where the abuse lasted over a decade. Yeah, so that's nothing to do with you. I installed CCTV in my home. Lots of people have CCTV installed in their home. People down my street have CCTV, ring doorbells, all these kind of things. More than 20 years ago. So even, not only does he have CCTV, was installed 20 years ago. It's nothing to do with Lucy Letby. Because of safety concerns, I still have that system in place. So why are you telling us about this? It's irrelevant. It's something one has to deal with. It's a crime, of course, to harass doctors and others who are giving evidence in good faith. Rather than attacking my opinion, or the reasons I was able to help convict Lucy Letby, I think those people should be asking questions of the individuals involved in the Letby inquiry before me, and why they failed to reach the diagnosis that my colleagues and I eventually did. Dr. Evans, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning, and indeed providing no examples of any abuse that you've received. So Liz Hull is saying, oh, poor Dr. Evans, he's getting abused, it's not fair. Dr. Evans comes onto the Radio 4 Today programme, asked to discuss the abuse that he's been receiving, and cannot cite one example of any abuse that he's received. I know for a fact that he hasn't received any abuse. I know for a fact that he doesn't have a social media presence. He doesn't have any social media accounts. If he'd been abused at his home in some way, it would be a criminal offence. He doesn't cite a criminal offence. He just says that he installed CCTV 20 years ago, as if that's relevant. It's just another indication of this guy being a complete shyster, as if we needed any more. Every time he opens his mouth, he just confirms it further still. As for Liz Hull to be citing this, it just has, as we know now, no credibility whatsoever. So then Liz Hull goes on to say, Ben Myers, who was Lucy Letby's original barrister, has never given a media interview. There are many things wrong with this case, but Mark McDonald's strategy is obviously very different, as I've spoken to other lawyers who say that that's not a strategy that they would adopt. So it's interesting that she said there are many things wrong with this case, because that's not reflected in anything that she produces or anything that she ever says. Then she goes on about how I'm not aware Mark McDonald has won a lot of miscarriage of justice cases by adopting this public media strategy. So what's Liz talking about now? Oh, surprisingly, it's the barristers now. The barristers, the lawyers, the court, the barristers, the lawyers, the court. You know, if this woman isn't married to a legal professional, it's truly a human tragedy. Although I think she would actually marry a court itself. Obviously, a court isn't a sentient being, but I think if it was possible, she'd marry an actual courtroom. You know, frankly, who cares about your crappy conversations with lawyers in which you suck up to them so you can make your podcast sound vaguely credible? What does that have to do with anything? It's another argument that has nothing to do with the real world. It has nothing to do with what happened in actual reality. It has nothing to do with medical evidence. It has nothing to do with whether there are any crimes on the unit. It has nothing to do with anything that is of any interest or relevance whatsoever. So then Liz Hull says, some people called them the smoking gun cases, referring to the insulin cases, because there was hard evidence that these babies had been poisoned. Lucy Letby was accused of putting insulin into their drips that were either feeding or giving them nutrients. The test results were discovered many months after the police started investigating. So I've covered the insulin cases in great depth in numerous videos. I may make more videos in the future. The first thing to say is that the statement Lucy Letby was accused of putting insulin into their drips, I would say is deliberately misleading, because she was accused of spiking feeding bags. She was not accused of... The implication here is that she directly put liquid into the drips while the children were being fed, which is not true. I've obviously been over this many times previously. There's no hard evidence for this. The bags weren't tested. She wasn't on duty. The testing is unreliable, if not of forensic quality. Liz is ignoring new evidence that is available. She's ignoring the countless misleading statements that were made with regards to the insulin cases that were made in court. So then Liz outdoes herself. The efficacy of these blood tests wasn't disputed in court. So again, it's the court. In fact, Lucy Letby herself admitted when she was cross-examined that someone on the ward must have poisoned them with insulin, but she just said categorically it wasn't me. So this is yet another example of Liz just repeating the prosecution case. It was almost pointless for her to turn up for this documentary because she hasn't raised a single original argument or anything that hasn't been heard in court previously. Lucy didn't admit that someone on the ward had poisoned the infant with insulin, as Liz puts it. This implies that Lucy had previously denied it. She doesn't know whether or not someone had poisoned someone with insulin. She was just told that there's categorical scientific evidence and therefore had no choice other than to accept this. If she'd denied it, then she would have been criticised for doing this instead. This was just a manipulative prosecution technique that Liz was either too stupid or too biased to recognise. Let's be generous towards Liz and assume that she's too stupid. A lot of the evidence that they presented at the press conference was not new in my opinion, Liz goes on to say. Regurgitation of evidence that had already been presented at the trial and been dismissed. I don't think I've seen anything to show that she's been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. So there's an inordinate amount of new medical material. There's very specifically 11 areas of new evidence. And I will say in Liz's defence, there's nothing anyone could possibly show her that would conceivably change her mind. There could be CCTV footage that completely exonerates Lucy, and she'd probably still sit there saying, well, I've spoken to some lawyers and I'm not sure this would be admissible in court. Then some barrister said this, and then there was some judge, and then there was some lawyers, and then there was some legal stuff, and then there was the court. Did I mention the court? Did I mention I was in court every day during the court case? She would never stop, ever. She's like the Arnold Schwarzenegger of citing court procedure and process. She's so heavily invested in her position and her podcast at this point, there'd have to be some sort of divine intervention before she admitted that there's any weaknesses in the court case. What is blatantly obvious to anyone else with a small collection of brain cells is that she's simply, plainly wrong, and her performance in this documentary did absolutely nothing to obviate that impression. And then she makes some appeal to emotion regarding the families, and we see her completely shamelessly doing this again here. This is in front of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, where Mark MacDonald is presenting the evidence to the appeals process, essentially. I think she makes some pretty shameless remarks here. I'm not going to go over them all. And then at the end of it, she claims, Mark MacDonald puts it back on her and said that she's been putting out a completely biased narrative purely for her own benefit, not for anyone else's benefit. And she sort of says, oh, it's my job, though. But isn't Mark MacDonald doing his job, in fact? Should he ignore the enormous swathe of evidence pointing to this being an unsafe conviction, pointing to this being a miscarriage of justice, pointing to Lucy Letby being innocent, pointing to there being no crimes on the unit? Because you say so, Liz. Because you've decided it'd be the right thing to do. Because you've decided that you should behave in a way that you've decided would be appropriate. And what's terrible about this is not the fact that she's pushing guilt all the time in this very shameless way. It's the fact that she's willing to brush all of this under the carpet, which is bad for Lucy Letby, of course, but she, on the one hand, will use the families as a shield for this conviction so she can protect her crappy podcast, but she won't think of the fact that the families must hear the truth. And that doesn't just apply to the families. It doesn't just apply to those that are involved with this case. This is of instrumental importance for the NHS, for healthcare, for children all over the country. She's willing to sweep all that to one side just so that she can say, my podcast was right. That's all she cares about. But at the same time, she calls herself a journalist and she pretends that she's objective. So I want to go over a quick list of things that Liz Hull completely ignored in this documentary. This is not an exhaustive list at all. I'm sure I could think of many more, but this is just a few things that I noticed from her comments that she'd declined to mention, and she must be aware of these things. So she ignored all of the other comments on the note, the so-called confession note that she cited. She ignored the fact that the explanation regarding this being a note that indicates trauma, not guilt, was given in court. She ignored that this explanation was also given during a police interview. She ignored all of the other notes, particularly the exculpatory blue post-it note. She ignored all of the revelations related to Catherine de Beger. She ignored recent expert opinion. She ignored the fact that literally no one with any sense thinks that the confession note is significant, even Professor David Wilson. She ignored the fact that the handover sheets are completely unrelated to the indictment. She ignored the fact that the prosecution themselves made it crystal clear in court that Lucy Letby only treasured one note and that this was unrelated to the indictment, but she still made this claim about trophies. She ignored the fact that most of the handover sheets are unrelated to the case. She ignored the fact that many sheets were found in a bin bag in Lucy Letby's garage ready to be thrown away, as were those under the bed that were in a Morrison's carrier bag, contrary to the way that Liz Hall presented it in the documentary. She ignored the fact that nurses have mentioned, many nurses, the majority of nurses, virtually all nurses have stated that taking handover sheets home inadvertently is not uncommon. She ignored the fact that the Facebook searches are completely unrelated to the indictment. She ignored the fact that many nurses, indeed many people, do Facebook searches. Essentially, this is nothing out of the ordinary. She ignored the fact that Lucy conducted many Facebook searches and very few of them were related to the case. In fact, it's an incredibly small percentage of the very large number of Facebook searches that she did. In the case of Child O, Liz Hull ignored the subcapsular hematoma. She ignored the previous coroner verdict. She ignored the pathology reports. She ignored the opinion of other pathologists who weren't in the court case. She ignored the document which indicates that aspiration did indeed draw blood, and that this is a very clear explanation for blood that indeed requires an explanation. She ignored the section from the panel preview report which mentions the needle aspiration. She ignored the obvious medical errors in the case of child O. She ignored the fact that the injection of air for child O is ridiculous. In the case of child C, she ignored the fact initially that Evans shifted the incident for child C. She ignored the clinical picture for child C. She ignored the established court regulations when it suited her. She ignored the lack of any actual hard evidence in the insulin cases. She ignored all the obvious arguments against the legitimacy of testing. She ignored the misleading statements that were made in court. She ignored the fact that Lucy Letby wasn't on duty for the insulin cases. She ignored the fact that the bags weren't tested. She ignored the new evidence that exists for the insulin cases. She ignored all of the new evidence for other cases and pretended that none of this existed. And she ignored an absolute mountain of medical evidence produced by a panel of international experts. Finally, she failed to mention and completely ignored the outstanding credentials of that panel compared to the experts who appeared in court. So I think we can reasonably conclude from that Liz Hull is a woman with no integrity. I wish I could say that she was stupid, because that would be a compliment at this point, but in order for her to maintain the position that she did during this programme, she had to engage in acts of intellectual contortion that can only be described as systematic bias. Obviously, we're aware of the payment that's been made to Caroline Cheetham, who's also involved in this podcast, that Liz Hull has declined to comment on. In this video that you can see on the screen now, Liz Hull was at the trial and doesn't understand why people won't listen to her, as it's described on Reddit. She was again sulking about the fact that people question her podcast. So let's see what she had to say at this particular event. And you were at Letby virtually every day, weren't you? I didn't realise that Liz was in court every day. I don't think I've heard her mention that before. She really should bring that more often. The debate around Letby, you're actually an expert, you were there, but there was debate from a lot of people who weren't there. And then Liz, this is the interviewer, the rather crass question that she's asked, and then Liz Hull goes on to say the following. There's so much misinformation out there. Yeah, Liz, and a lot of it comes from you. One of the strangest things I've ever seen in my career, that this refusal to accept the verdict of a jury. Yeah, because, juries are always correct. I mean, the fact that the jury has no medical understanding whatsoever, the judge has no medical understanding whatsoever, the barristers have no medical understanding whatsoever, and that it's a medical case, that should not prevent us from just accepting the word of the jury as being gospel. We should never question the word of that random selection of people, and one of them had to be chucked out because they couldn't keep their mouth shut. And a lot of people that are calling themselves experts on social media that didn't turn up for one day to the court case. Were you in court, Liz? I didn't realise you were in court. You really should bring that up more often. Or, it's a very complicated case. Firstly, as well, I should mention, people on social media are not calling themselves experts. People who are experts are calling themselves experts. Even then, they don't often call themselves experts. They just say, I'm a professor or doctor in this particular specialism. This is my opinion. Obviously, I'm likely to be correct. There's not people, and people on social media do not call themselves experts. People on social media obviously point out the fact that your podcast is crap, firstly, and then secondly, this is an extremely unsafe conviction, and then sometimes they cite the views of people who are experts, which doesn't apply to you, Liz. It's actually incredible that the interviewer describes you as an expert in the opening comments. I really should have dwelled on that longer, but let's just move on. It's not one that where there's a smoking gun and there's a bit of information that is, it was a jigsaw case. She likes a jigsaw analogy. She likes to bring that jigsaw analogy up whenever she can. Where there was a lot of different pieces of information that meant the jury reached the verdict they did. So that's just basically a repetition of the strands argument that we've heard earlier. There's a lot of strands, so unless you're in court, you can't comment on all the crappy strands. You just have to keep your mouth shut. Only the jury's allowed to comment. It's frustrating because as a court reporter, that's essentially my job. I didn't realise you were a court reporter, Liz. Were you in court? You really should bring this up more often. That's what I do. I'm a court reporter, so it's my job to report what happens in the courts, and the courts found it guilty. Did the court find it guilty? You hardly ever bring up the court. Were you in court, Liz? You really should bring this up more often. So that's what we reported on our podcast, which and it's very hard because a lot of journalists now have come over a lot of criticism for reporting that verdict. No, that's not true. It's just you, Liz, and Judith Moritz to a slightly lesser extent. You've been criticised because you refuse to be objective about it. No one's criticising Josh Halliday because he did his court reporting and did that professionally and has now looked at all this information and has changed his mind. He's took that into consideration and he's altered his worldview. The reason you're being criticised is because you're a shit journalist. It's not a lot of journalists, just shit journalists will be rightly criticised. Because there's a whole kind of social media group, I suppose, of people that won't accept that verdict. And of course, we should always accept the verdict of the court. It goes without saying. So overall, more asinine remarks from Liz Hull there. As for Liz Hull's performance in this documentary, it's almost as if she went into it with the intention of deliberately making herself look bad. She is a shell of a human being, and inside her, instead of blood running through her veins, the sort of healthy conscience that any human being should have, and the beating heart of a healthy person, is an anemic recording going, the court, the jury, the court, the barristers, the court, the trial, the court, the verdict, the judge, the court, the sentence, the court, the court, the court. That's all she has left to stand on. That's why she goes on about it so much, because she's completely marooned with nothing else left.